Namaskar. We have until now seen a few modules in human geography. We continue to do the same with a new module today. The module is on human races of the world. If you look at the population and the people of the world, they are of different color, different shades of colors, and different appearances. We seem to ask a question, why are they so different? What made them different? There are indeed several questions as to the nature of human resources. The first and the most important question we ask is, what is the nature of human races? Are they biological basis to human differences? Or is the concept of race merely a cultural construction? If a race has a biological basis, how do these differences come about? How long has variations like the one we see around us been around? And what are the implications of the way we divide the human species? In order to look at these questions, we should really go back in time and look at the evolution of human species from the time we began to walk on our 2 feet and became Homo sapiens much later. Much of our biology and behavior is framed within an evolutionary background. We have to understand the question of races from this evolutionary background. Modern humans are a part of the natural world. As vertebrates, mammals, and primates, we share a host of biological features with these animals. One of the things that we will be concerned with in this class is to examine the development of those features that make us unique. In fact, the question we would like to answer is, why are we unique from other animals? If you look at Homo sapiens, the evidence we have are all in the fossils. Through the study of the fossil records, and more recently, comparisons of the genetic material of living humans and fragments of the genetic materials from several extinct human groups. Being able to begin the reconstruction of our species as separate and as having a separate evolutionary history. We last shared a common ancestor with our closest living primate relatives, which are the African apes, chimpanzees, and gorillas, who lived probably between 5 and 8 million years ago. Comparisons of our genetic material with that of chimpanzees reveals that we are about 98.3% to 98.6% genetically identical with the African ape. It has also been estimated that differences is only about 50 genes separate them from us. If we look at the human origins, we are distantly related to gorillas about 10 million years ago, and to chimpanzees about 5 to 8 million years ago. And we have evolved as a separate human species only in the last 2 or so million years ago. If you look at the fossil history and the fossil evidences studied and documented, we understand the first ever human population began its evolution in the continent of Africa. It's from the continent of Africa the humans have migrated to different parts of the world. The migration itself began sometime about 100 or so thousand years ago. It was about, say, 40,000 years ago, a group of humans went into Europe. About 60 or 1,000 years ago, a group of humans came into India and then spread further into Australia. And by the time they reached Australia, it was almost about 40,000 years ago. And the human groups reached South America, the very southern end of South America, about 10,000 years ago. So when we come to the question of races, we have a first consideration. That is, the concept of race is one of the most misunderstood ideas of human history, and that one has caused a great deal of misery and harm in the world, in the ancient and the old world, and also in the modern world. So the initial points that must be considered are whether or not there is some biological and evolutionary reality to the question of race, or whether this aspect of human biology has been put through a cultural filter. So just how does our society define race? So we get to the study of race. For much of human history, people have been concerned about the nature and meaning of the physical differences that distinguish human populations across the world. Often, in addition to their biological features, members of different racial groups also had psychological and emotional attributes attributed to them. The question is there a reality to the human difference? In fact, there is a reality to human difference. There are all sorts of differences amongst humans. And we are all aware that people vary in facial and body features. We also know that these differences extend to the genetic materials themselves. In other words, such differences are biological and could be identified genetically. Indeed, there are parts of the human genome that are so hypervariable that examination of these specific locales can identify specific individuals with a 1 in 88,000 chance of mistaking one person with another. Of course, this is very far-fetched. Therefore, the big question is this individual or population variation? The question can be answered in several ways. One of the easiest ways to answer the question is all humans vary except for identical twins. But that is also a specific case. And usually by adulthood, there are differences resulting from environmental influences even amidst twins. This variation is a result of the complex interaction of both genetic and environmental influences. All we are trying to say is that the genetic differences then become highlighted by the environmental influences later in the life of human beings. If you look at different human beings from different parts of the world, you will naturally see the human variations. The human variations are not only in color but also in appearances, also in the body structure, that is called anatomy. So there are so many different variations among the humans around the world that we tend to think race is indeed a genetic as well as an environmental result. The reality of a race is that there are consistent differences between different human populations. For example, if we placed 100 sand bushmen from southern Africa in a room with 100 native Japanese and also with 100 native Swedes and with 100 native Australians. All of you could sort out the members of each of these populations with 100% accuracy. However, if we place 100 Egyptians in another room with 100 Sudanese and 100, say, Turkish people with 100 Jordanians, it would be extremely difficult to sort them out as different people. In other words, certain variations are distributed across the world, whereas in certain locales there are invariably not very many variations or differences among the people. Therefore, people are distinct across broad geographical ranges. For example, between the populations from the Kalahari and from Sweden. However, humans are continuously distributed with no distinct borders or boundaries separating them. Biological features gradually change from one geographical area to another. That there is both a reality of human difference between people from distant locales and at the same time no reality to the concept of racial groups bounded by distinct borders. So if you look at human population distribution based on a number of nuclear genetic pool, you'll tend to have differences across the world, but in very broad geographical regions rather than in narrow geographical pockets. So now let's see the social concept of race. Race is also a socially and culturally constructed concept. Other socially constructed races, for example, African Americans, who are, as we know, are blacks, or Europeans, who are, as we know, are whites, and the Asians, the brown people. They all have little biological reality and are often based on behavioral and cultural stereotypes, or simply on skin color. So if you look at different people with different skin colors and call them as people belonging to different races, then such a division of mankind could be considered as more social and environmentally influenced than biological. Race is a social concept, but biologically unsupportable. But in the world, a biological view of race exists. The anatomy of a given group is used in comparison with that of other racial groups to investigate how people adapt to environments. It is essentially value-free. That is, the biological view of race is value-free. If we can look at one or two examples of early racial classifications, the one that comes to our mind is the one given by Homer. Homer, who lived between 1200 and 850 BC, is also the one who wrote Iliad and Odyssey, who acknowledged the variability among human beings. He acknowledged the variations among the people at the eastern and western edges of the known world at that time. The second racial classification is by Herodotus, who lived between 484 and 425 before Christ. History argues for an environmental cause of variability between human groups. Egyptians have strong skulls due to exposure. Persian skulls are brittle due to the use of felt hats. This is the conclusion of Herodotus. The third classification is by Hippocrates. Hippocrates lived between 460 and 377 BC. Hippocrates focuses on the environmental influences on the human variability and noted in his volume Corpus Hippocraticum. According to him, body build and temperament of different peoples are said to be related to their cultural and lifestyle. So now we get to the definition of human race. According to Houghton, who wrote about the definition of human race, a race is a great division of mankind, the members of which, through individually varying, are characterized as a group by a certain combination of morphological and metrical features, principally non-adaptive, which have been derived from their common descent. Bruce, much later in 1990, defines a race as a division of species which differs from other divisions by the frequency with which certain hereditary traits appear among its members. Now we have already seen skin color is perhaps one that differentiates human races, and this is essentially a cultural and environmental factor influencing the variation. Skin color, as you know, is due primarily to the presence of a pigment called melanin. Both light and dark complexion people have this pigment. However, two forms are produced: phenomelanin, which is red to yellow in color, and eumelanin, which is dark brown to black. People with light complexion mostly produce pheomelanin, while those with dark color mostly produce eumelanin. To a lesser extent, the color is also affected by the presence of fat under the skin and keratin, a reddish-orange pigment in the skin. So the skin color is caused by the pigment called melanin, which can be differentiated to produce different colors of the human skin. So if you look at the distribution of human skin, the whole of the South, including India, is said to have darker or brown color, whereas the whole of the North seem to have the whites and the yellows. Now comes the question, how many races are there in the world? The number of races has been a dispute. Different people have said there are different number of races. Linnaeus, for example, in 1758 considered there are 4 major races, to which 3 others can be included, which could, however, be imaginary. On the other hand, Blumenbach in 1784 has considered only 5 races across the world. Houghton in 1926 has suggested 3 races, but at many different levels. Gone in 1965 has suggested 9 races with 2 lower level races. So there is no compromise between the number of races. Different people think there are different number of races. And in recent times, people have thought the number of races are about 9 plus 2 lower level races. Now, if you consider a particular variety, that is of the blacks, who we could identify as black. If you look at different people in different parts of the world, for example, in Africa, in North America, in South America, and in Asia, it would become very difficult to self-identify any one particular person as black. Because even among the so-called blacks today, there are people who are light complexioned, almost like white. It is because of the fact that across the world today there are more mixes among the races. If you happen to go to Africa and see people across Africa in very many different countries, you would find there are whites and there are blacks, and there are what you may call in-betweens. And if you happen to visit India, for example, then you will also see in India there are people who could be considered whites, yellows or mongoloids, and also browns, like most of us. So it becomes difficult to identify a particular race only in terms of color, because there are such mixes today among all the races of the world. The major races being white or the Caucasian. Also, Indians could be considered as Caucasoids because of the appearances, even though they are mostly browns. So blacks are another racial majority, and the yellows or the mongoloids are the third racial majority. And if you see the distribution across the world, the white and the yellows are distinctly distributed in the northern parts of the world, and the blacks and browns are distributed in the southern continents, South America, Africa, and Asia. Australia and New Zealand could be different because of the mix of people, the whites, the yellows, and the blacks, because these are countries where there are different races because of large migration that have happened in recent history. So human races of the world are different. They could be biologically differentiated as much as socially and culturally differentiated. Much of the color could be considered as an influence of the environment if we consider all people came from Africa. African continent gave rise to black people who migrated to different parts of the world, and in the process of mix with other people became people of different races, the whites, the yellows, the blacks, and the browns. So race is a social and cultural concept, and it has to be treated as such, even though there are certain biological characteristics that differentiate the races across the world. Thank you. Thank you very much.